when you lose the estrogen is a hormone that is protective against belly fat specifically. And that's why post-menopausal women will notice not only a shift in body composition, they gain more fat because they become more insulin resistant, which means their body has to produce more insulin to get the job done. And that triggers the body set point in your brain that you need to gain more fat, but you gain more of it around your midsection. So that's another reason that people in perimenopause and postmenopausal tend to see more belly fat, is they're losing that protective effect of estrogen.
Today's episode is with Dr. Morgan Nolte. Dr. Morgan is a board-certified clinical specialist in geriatric physical therapy, and she's also the founder of Weight Loss for Health, which is an online course, community, and coaching program that helps women learn the science behind insulin resistance, weight loss, and habit change. Her mission is to help adults lose weight, keep it off, and prevent the conditions that she treats in her geriatric physical therapy clinic by living a low insulin lifestyle. So in today's episode, Dr. Morgan and I are going to be chatting all about perimenopause and menopause. We're going to dive into what's happening from a hormonal perspective during these stages of a female's life. We're also going to chat about what factors to focus on so you can actually be prepared for it, why some women struggle with weight loss during this time, how insulin resistance plays a role, and a lot more. Let's jump into the episode. All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and I'm here with Dr. Morgan Nolte. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm super excited you're here. We were talking off air how we tried to record, I think it's been a month now,
Yep.
And we had some technical issues, but I'm glad that we're back and hopefully everything goes smoothly today.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And I was also on your podcast, so we'll talk about that at the end, where everybody can find your podcast, find your website, all of that. That was a really fun episode to record. So I'm happy to have you on so I can grill you with all the questions today.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. All right. So why don't we start off, before we get into our topic today, why don't we just start off with you giving a little intro on your background, who you are, how you got into the nutrition space?
Yeah. So I'm Morgan. Just call me Morgan. I'm from a little town in Nebraska outside of Plattsmouth. Huge Nebraska Cornhusker football fan. Die-hard hopeful fan, even though we're pretty terrible every year. Married to a farmer. So we're in the thick of harvest, and that's almost done. We have two sweet children. Dawson is 3.5. Leah is 1.5. So I'm a busy working mom. And by trade, I'm a geriatric specialized physical therapist. That means I did 3 years of a doctorate level education for physical therapy. And then on top of that, I did a 1-year geriatric residency. And I'm very well versed in managing people who have chronic health conditions. I shouldn't say chronic, but certainly multiple comorbidities is what we call them in geriatric PT. Now, how I got into this field was I kept noticing patterns in my patients, specifically when I worked in the skilled nursing facility. So I have a lot of post-acute and home care experience. And I noticed that rarely, pretty much never, did I get someone with just diabetes or just heart disease or just dementia. They came pretty much in a trio. And as I've grown in my practice, I've even grown in the boldness to reach out to doctors and say, hey, I think this person has undiagnosed diabetes. You might want to check that out. Because they do occur so often together, I thought there's got to be a link here. There has to be an underlying trigger for all of these conditions to occur so in tandem with each other. And I kind of followed this breadcrumb trail to insulin resistance. I started researching more on my own. I started reading really good books like Dr. Jason Fung's The Diabetes Code, The Obesity Code. He has another book, The Cancer Code. And it really just clicked for me like, oh, this is why all of my patients are on all of these medications. My record is 35 prescribed medications for someone.
Wow.
Yep, that raised her eyebrows for those listening to just the podcast. And it was heartbreaking. I really had to go out on my own because my heart was broken because I'd worked with so many older adults who could have prevented what they were going through. And then further, I saw their adult children following in their footsteps on this unhealthy lifestyle. So I am so motivated to help people prevent the disease that I treat in physical therapy and geriatric physical therapy, like diabetes, dementia, heart disease, cancer, osteoarthritis. Insulin resistance is truly at the core of all of them. And I know today we're going to touch on menopause, and I can explain, a woman's risk of heart disease is lower before menopause, lower than men. And then after menopause, it equalizes with men. Why is that? Right? Well, when you go through menopause, your estrogen drops. When your estrogen drops, you lose the protection that you have against insulin resistance, and your insulin resistance goes up. And then they start getting more symptoms that we can talk about later. So that was kind of one angle that I got into this. And then the other angle is my son. After I had my son, I was struggling to lose the baby weight. And I thought, geez, you studied nutrition, exercise, and health science in college. You're a physical therapist. I just didn't want to accept my body at 10 to 15 pounds overweight. I wanted to feel confident. I wanted to feel fit. I wanted to feel like I had energy. And I certainly just wasn't going to settle for what I had. And so I kind of came at this from the weight loss research too. And I really researched weight loss, specifically sustainable weight loss, as to what works. And surprisingly to me, it also comes back to insulin resistance, because insulin is your fat creation and storage hormone. And so both of my worlds kind of collided on this concept. And I started applying these principles of a more animal-based diet, higher protein, higher healthy fat, higher fiber, prioritizing resistance training over cardio, prioritizing my sleep and my stress management. And I weigh 10 pounds less with lower body fat than I did in high school after having 2 children. And so I've applied the principles to my own lifestyle. And then that's what I teach my clients how to do, is really come at this from a holistic, science-based approach on not just weight loss, because that's easy. I mean, I think that anyone can lose weight. It's a much bigger task to keep it off. And it's an even bigger task to lose weight in a way that you can keep it off. So that's what I really like to do, is help people lose weight and improve their health in a way that's sustainable. That's how I got into this space.
I love it. Love it. Definitely, one of the things you said about losing the weight versus actually maintaining that weight loss. I mean, that's something that it's so easy to say that, but it's such a process to kind of be able to solidify that. Whoops, I just hit my mic. Be able to solidify that and understand that it's not just about the nutrition alone. There's so many other, you were already talking about, stress management, sleep, resistance training, that all plays into it. And it's typically those things that people think they know these things, but then it's they want kind of the sexier thing or the quick fix or something to help with that. And it's usually going back to the basics and really just solidifying those and building those habits that makes the biggest difference. And I love what you said about all of those things. So kind of getting into today's topic, I didn't mention it yet. You mentioned a little bit, but we really want to focus on talking about menopause and this concept that people hear of weight loss resistance when you get to that stage of your life. I know we were talking off air, I've gotten so many questions in terms of just yesterday, actually, I got someone message me on Instagram asking if I had any resources on my podcast related to, what they should, prepare themselves for as they're going into menopause. A lady, you mentioned that she was just afraid of gaining all the weight and afraid of just not being able to sustain where she's at. So maybe we can just start to chat a little bit about some of the misconceptions that people associate with menopause and kind of thinking that it's, you're just going to gain a ton of weight and it's impossible to even lose weight in menopause. And maybe we can talk through some of the things that happen. You can kind of dive into some of the science and we can go from there if you're down for that.
Yes. And by no means am I a menopause expert. So I want to put that out there. I have not been through menopause. People can go through menopause surgically if they have a hysterectomy, depending on the type, but I have learned some, and I know a lot quite about insulin resistance. And I think it's really important to recognize the sooner you take control of your health habits, the better. So negative health habits will continue to compound throughout your 30s and your 40s. And then by the time you hit 50, that's really when when they're going to start slowing you down. And then 60 is pretty much when you're going to be significantly reduced in your quality of life and mobility. That's just how aging works. That's how insulin resistant, that's how unhealthy aging works. So going through menopause it's important to recognize there's a period of like up to 8 years of perimenopause. So irregular periods leading up to menopause, which is 1 year following your last period. That's when you're technically going through menopause. It's a point in time. And then after that, you're post-menopausal. And in this perimenopause state, your hormones can just go haywire. And your progesterone and your estrogen levels drop. And then they get really low, as you approach menopause and then postmenopausal. And so what's important to recognize here is how it can present is a lot of mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, weight gain, brain fog, sometimes like sugar cravings. Those can be signs of just those fluctuating hormones. If you think about PMSing, if you're not in perimenopause, how you feel in PMS, but not in a predictable manner at all. And so then for menopause, from the hormone standpoint, when your hormones are fluctuating like that, you can get hot flashes that wake you up at night, okay, and really disturb sleep. And when you don't sleep well, your cortisol goes up. That's your stress hormone. When that goes up, your blood sugar goes up. When your blood sugar goes up, your blood insulin goes up. When your insulin goes up, your weight goes up. And insulin resistance is when insulin is elevated, too high for too long. So that's one way that perimenopause can affect things. But the other is, as I mentioned, when you lose the estrogen is a hormone that is protective against belly fat specifically. And that's why postmenopausal women will notice not only a shift in body composition, they gain more fat because they become more insulin resistant, which means their body has to produce more insulin to get the job done. And that triggers the body set point in your brain that you need to gain more fat, but you gain more of it around your midsection. So that's another reason that people in perimenopause and postmenopausal tend to see more belly fat, is they're losing that protective effect of estrogen against insulin resistance. And then the third thing that I've learned recently is your gut lining changes as you go through menopause. So you actually lose some of the gut health that you maybe had coming into this phase of life. It might become leaky. You might not tolerate like dairy or grains as well as you once did because your actual gut microbiome is changing as your hormones change. And that's another thing to keep in mind too, going through menopause, is noticing how you're reacting to different foods. So when I'm talking about insulin resistance and like how do you lose weight in perimenopause and postmenopause, it's not any different. Like it's not any different than how you would lose weight optimally when you were younger. And I'm going to talk about a resource for supplements because I do think that this is a great time in life where you might want to look at some more supplements for like sleep, stress management, metabolism. And I'm an advocate. I don't prescribe it, but I think that correctly dosed and timed hormone replacement therapy can be really beneficial for preventing cognitive decline later in life, maintaining bone health and muscle, which estrogen is very important for. That's why we see bone health and muscle mass decline as well after menopause. And so you have to work with your OB I call him an OBGYN, your doctor, to see if hormone replacement therapy is right for you. I do not make any recommendations beyond that. It's really a personal choice between you and your provider. So that's one thing that we can do. But the supplements that I like are from the XX Brain. And this is a book by Dr. Lisa Mosconi. And she gives the supplement, what it's indicated for, the efficacy based on research, and a suggested dosage, which I think is really helpful. And then she has tables for sleep support, stress and anxiety support, and metabolism and insulin regulation. So if someone's really interested in supplementing during this season of life, I'd highly recommend that book. You Count Out Supplement a Bad Diet and Poor Lifestyle Choices. And that's really where I wanted to focus this interview, is what are the basics that I think people might be overlooking or missing? And then what are some barriers to implementing those basics?
Yeah, I love that. We will definitely link that book in the show notes so everybody can check it out if you want to check that out for sure in terms of the supplemental side of things. But I love what you said in terms of, you can't out supplement a bad diet. I say that all the time, no matter what stage of your life you're in. So yeah, let's dive into some of the basics. Maybe we can just start with some of the basics in terms of kind of within those categories that you talked about with sleep, stress management, diet itself, like exercise, like what are the basics in terms of what people should be focusing on and kind of the big movers versus things that maybe people are focusing too much on that are maybe making a little difference, but they're not the things that make the biggest difference. If that makes sense. I kind of just worded that very confusing, but hopefully
the same way when I ask questions. Before we get, is it okay if we can talk about some like signs of insulin resistance?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's still kind of a newer concept, just to kind of back it up for people. So insulin is a hormone made by your pancreas. It's an anabolic hormone, and there's an insulin receptor in every cell of your body. So depending on the cell, that will impact the action that it has upon that cell. I focus mostly on how insulin can reduce blood sugar. So there's only two ways to reduce blood sugar: movement, so muscle demand, and insulin. And that's because both of those will move what's called a GLUT4 transporter to the cell membrane. It acts like a tube slide, and then glucose can move out of your blood sugar and into your cell. Now, you have glycogen, so that's a short-term energy storage, and that's in your liver and your muscles. From what I've looked at, it's about 2,000 calories worth of glycogen storage in your body. And then you have your fat. So you're going to fill up the glycogen, then you'll fill up the fat storage. That's unlimited storage for body fat or adipose tissue. And so that's really insulin's role, is to maintain tight blood sugar regulation. Your body doesn't like change. And I think when we're talking about insulin resistance, that can be kind of a newer term. Just think of it as antibiotic resistance. Like when people take antibiotics for a long time, they become resistant to its effect. Or alcohol resistance. So if people are used to getting a buzz after 2 drinks, but then they continually drink or do drugs, it takes more and more of the same substance to get the same effect. It's the same with insulin. And that's why insulin can actually predict type 2 diabetes up to 2 decades before blood glucose. Because if you're watching on YouTube, I talk with my hands. So your insulin kind of keeps your glucose in a pretty stable range, right? So if you're only testing blood glucose, that's what you see. But then all of a sudden you might see some pre-diabetes, especially in the perimenopause, menopause state. And that's because behind the scenes, if you're not taking care of yourself, your insulin goes up and up and up to maintain quote unquote normal blood sugars. But when your body reaches its capacity for producing insulin, it's no longer able to keep blood sugars in normal range. And that's when we start seeing prediabetes. Your body has maxed out its insulin potential. Your cells are resistant to the effects of insulin because they've been exposed to high amounts of insulin for a long period of time, just like antibiotic resistance, alcohol, or drug resistance. And so I hope people have a little better understanding of that, because it's very important. Up to 88% of adults have insulin resistance. 88% is a very high number.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't even know it exists. They don't know anything about it. So a really good quiz, a great resource if you really want to learn more, is Dr. Benjamin Bickman's book, Why We Get Sick. And I had him on my podcast, and he was a really great interview. And he has a quiz in his book that I'd like to share with your audience. And then if they're watching or listening, they can do a mental inventory. And I want them to count how many of these questions they say yes to. So, do you have more fat around your belly than you'd like? Do you have high blood pressure, which means it's over 120 over 80? Do you have a family history of heart disease? Do you have high levels of blood triglycerides? Do you retain water easily? Do you have patches of darker colored skin or little bumps of skin, like skin tags, at your neck, armpits, or other areas? Do you have a family member with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes? Do you have polycystic ovarian syndrome for women or erectile dysfunction for men? So if your audience answered yes to one of those questions, then Dr. Bickman says you likely have insulin resistance. If they answered yes to 2 or more, he says you most certainly have insulin resistance. It's a level of severity that we would be worried about. And if you already have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, you do have insulin resistance. That is insulin resistance when we see those blood glucose numbers go up. And so it's really important, I think, just to get the word out there on, like, what is it? How do I know if I have it? Because so many women are looking to, like, the grass is greener on the other diet. And it's like, nope, there is no person, there is no diet that is going to fix this. You have to look in the mirror. You are the only person that can fix this. And really empowering them, putting the power back in their own hands to educate themselves. Because I believe when we know better, we can do better. And that's kind of where we come into the next part of the conversation on, well, what are we doing wrong? Like, what are some misconceptions about losing weight? And I believe these myself, mind you. You know, I had to really come to terms with some of the stuff that I was taught in undergrad being outdated, wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Getting over the calories in, calories out. Your body doesn't have a receptor for calories. Your body has receptors for different types of nutrients. Calories are just a made up, man-made concept to try to measure something that your body uses hormones to measure. And so I like to explain, you know, there's not a calorie receptor in your body. There's an insulin receptor in every cell. So I think that's an important thing to recognize, is your body is super lazy. Your body is smart. So it's a lazy, smart body, and it uses hormones to automate absolutely everything possible. You're not thinking about making your heart beat. You're not thinking about digesting your food. You're not thinking about, oh, is my hair growing today? Is my skin moisturizing itself? How fast am I breathing right now? Now, all of that is controlled by hormones. And so is your level of body fat. So is everything else related to your weight and body composition. It is controlled by hormones. And so when we shift the conversation from how many points or how many calories does this have, and we really look at the science behind how will this affect my insulin, which is the hormone responsible for my level of, body weight, my body fat, that's when you're going to start really seeing those long-term results. So I really like to get people away from the points or the calories, the diet mentality, and towards a more holistic approach for lowering insulin, living a low insulin lifestyle. And I think it's very empowering because there are so many different things to optimize. And there's not one prescriptive diet or exercise plan. You can start where you're at and pick a couple of things that we'll talk about and go from there. And whenever I give an interview, I really like to preface it with, do not get overwhelmed. Do not start beating yourself up or thinking you have to go change all these things. That's a counterproductive use of your mental energy. I want you to think about the lowest hanging fruit that I talk about that could have the biggest impact for you, whether that's focusing on your sleep, stress, movement, nutrition. We'll talk about it all. So that's one big thing, is focusing on calories. And then we're faced with the next question. Well, how does food affect my insulin? And that's where macronutrients become very helpful. So when it comes to macronutrients, there's three main kinds: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And each of those macronutrients will affect insulin differently. So fat actually has the lowest effect on insulin. There's different healthy, neutral, unhealthy fats that we can talk about. Protein has a moderate impact on insulin. Carbohydrates, specifically starch and sugar, will have the highest impact on insulin. And I'm not saying you can't eat carbs. I'm not promoting a keto diet. I'm not promoting a carnivore diet. I eat carbs. I eat cookies. Nothing is off limits. I think moderation is key. However, it's important to recognize that if you're insulin resistant, and 88% of adults are, you're not going to tolerate a higher carbohydrate load well, unless you have everything else dialed in. You're exercising a lot, you're sleeping, and you're managing your stress, which, let's be real, very few people are doing those things optimally. So fiber is the other type of carbohydrate, and depending on people's gut health, they can tolerate different amounts of fiber, but it's great for your health. It can help slow digestion and slow the blood glucose response. So in addition to how does it impact your insulin, I think it's also important to realize, how does it impact your satiety hormones? And carbohydrates like starches and sugars don't trigger your gut hormones, peptide YY and CCK, and you're not going to feel very full after eating that meal unless it's a high volume like fiber, because that's going to cause the gut distension and short-term satiety. So we're talking like meal to meal, what's going to keep you fullest, and it's fat and protein. Those are the things that are really going to help keep you full meal to meal. That's why you always have room for dessert, even after a big meal, because it just doesn't trigger satiety. And so when we're talking about nutrition, recognizing no food is off limits, at least in my approach. But starches and sugars, even, we have to look at a starch is just different molecules of glucose strung together. And that glucose can be deposited, metabolized pretty much anywhere in the body. But sugar, especially added sugar, is 50% glucose, 50% fructose, which is a type of simple sugar. And that fructose is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver. And so when you have a teaspoon of sugar running through like your 5 liters of blood, that's your baseline, 4 grams, 1 teaspoon. And then you have a 41 gram sugar pop, that's what's in a can of Pepsi, and half of that is fructose. Your liver has to convert that sugar quickly, and the fastest way it does that is into liver fat. And that's why we're seeing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease rising in this country, because of an overconsumption of processed foods and foods that are high in added sugar that act like a missile. The fructose just goes straight to the liver and it's processed as liver fat. And then you get insulin resistance in the liver.
I just want to clarify one thing too, because I know that people are listening. They're like, fructose. Oh, that's the main sugar in fruit. So how can you just decipher the difference between the sugar that you would get from a Coca-Cola versus fruit, obviously, and they both contain fructose, but how does your body kind of recognize the difference between that?
The concentration is really important. So how much fructose you're getting from a piece of fruit is different than how much you're getting in a Pepsi. So it's lower. And then the other nutrients that you get with the fruit, such as fiber, some fruit will have fat or fat depending on the fruit. And that'll slow the digestion too. So there's other nutrients that come with the fruit. that helps slow the digestion, and there's less fructose overall compared to strictly added sugar that's in the pop or the candy bar or where else. That's why added sugar is worse for your health than like a starchy food, for example. And I think that there's really cool things like if you eat your carbohydrates like with some protein and fat, or if you eat the carbohydrate after some protein or fat, or if you have a couple tablespoons of apple cider vinegar before your carbohydrate meal. Those are 3 simple tips just to reduce the glycemic impact or the blood sugar response of eating carbs, even going for a walk after you eat your meal, timing your carbohydrates appropriately so that you use them during a workout. You don't have to cut carbs, you just have to, I think, especially when we're dealing with insulin resistance and optimizing things through perimenopause and menopause, it's time to optimize, and so we have to pick our sweets intentionally. We have to become very mindful of emotional eating. And that's a whole nother topic of behavioral counseling on emotional eating. So
yeah. And we talk all about that, obviously, on this podcast, all about metabolic flexibility. We talked about that when we were talking on your podcast that, you shouldn't fear carbs, but using them strategically and smart, being smart about them, especially if you are someone who is, if you can say yes to those questions that you said, or just have signs that overall insulin resistance is something that's present, or if you are, especially if you're pre-diabetic and you're struggling with that blood sugar dysregulation. I do have 2 questions for you. So the first one would be, we talk about insulin resistance. This is something that I did a lot too. When I first got into like keto and low carb, is I was like, insulin is the devil. Like insulin, like you never want insulin to go up. Like you always want it to be like low. And I've learned since then, we have insulin in our body for a reason. Like that is a hormone that we have to have. And they're like, for insulin to go up after you eat a meal, like that is normal to happen. What's not normal or what's, adverse is if it's constantly elevated 24/7 and all the issues that you said. But can you just also just kind of explain a little bit why, insulin itself might not just be like that in itself is not the devil. It's what happens from everything else that you mentioned, just to kind of clear that up. Cause I know a lot of people are like, I need to keep my insulin as low as possible all the time. Like I can't have, and this goes back to the carbs thing, like can't have any carbs, any sugar. Like, can we just talk about that a little bit?
Well, first of all, has to be sustainable. So if you're thinking some way you have to cut carbs, like, well, you want to do that for the rest of your life? No, then don't do it now. So just really embrace that long-term mindset. But insulin is an anabolic hormone, again, so it can help stimulate muscle growth. It can do lots of good things in the body. But when we want to have a clear example, look at a type 1 diabetic. That's someone whose body, their pancreas actually doesn't produce insulin. And so that's completely different from a type 2 diabetic. What happens when someone has type 1 diabetes is their blood sugars go sky high, their appetite goes sky high, they're thirsty all the time, and they cannot gain weight. No insulin, no weight gain. But they're wasting away. And so it's very interesting because they can't gain weight, but that's not healthy. And it used to be a fatal disease before they discovered how to create the synthetic insulin, and people can give themselves insulin as a type 1 diabetic because the cells are starving to death. There's plenty of sugar in the bloodstream, but it can't get into the cells for energy. And that's why they're always hungry. That's why they're always thirsty, because their cells think they're starving to death because the sugar can't get in unless they were to move to stimulate that GLUT4 transporter. So that's a really good example of why insulin is actually vital to our survival, is type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, I love that example.
Yeah.
Cool. And then my next question, or my second question, just to kind of talk to the calorie side of things. So in terms of like with your clients or, your method, can you talk a little bit about why like calories, they're not the end all be all, but like they are something that matters, like in terms of weight loss, like calories. And this is a big mistake that a lot of people do when they start like a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet. They're like, oh, okay, like my insulin is going to be super low, so I'll just eat all the fat and all the food and I'll lose weight, when we know that that's not what's going to happen unless you kind of manage the intake. So maybe we can just like talk a little bit about how, calories might not be the main thing. And there's so many other things that, are important for fat loss and important for sustainable fat loss, but they still matter to a degree, right? Like, would you agree with that?
I would say it's certainly not the first thing I look at. I like the Carb Manager app. And so I get them set up on that. I help them calculate how much protein they need. We can talk about that. I seriously hardly ever look at their calorie load. Most women are under eating because they're used to restrictive diets. I mean, if you're eating just a ton and a ton of food, yeah, you might not lose weight, but there's probably a reason behind that that needs to be addressed more than just saying eat less food. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and what I like to do is I say, when you're properly fueling your body with enough protein and healthy fat and fiber, you're going to be satiated and you're not really going to need to overeat. So a lot of my clients are very full. Regarding the protein, I like up to 1 gram per ideal pound of body weight. So if you want to weigh 140 pounds, I recommend aiming for like 140 grams of protein a day. That's the highest. And I love intermittent fasting. We don't need to get into that today. But it's a really important tool for reversing insulin resistance, even if it's 12 hours a day, even if it's 14 hours a day. I think a lot of people are afraid of it. I'm like, well, take the drama out of it. You're fasting already overnight when you're sleeping. It doesn't need to be this dramatic thing. And so if they're doing 2 meals a day, what I like to say is get your minimum protein per meal to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis, 25 to 30 grams of a quality complete protein. And then what I've heard, I don't know if you've heard this, or if you've heard something different. I've heard kind of 55 to 65 grams is the maximum dose per meal that your body can use at a time. And so I recommend, if you're not comfortable eating 140 grams of protein in 2 meals, aim for 25 to 55-ish grams per meal. Have you heard of an upper range, or does it depend on their training?
Yeah, so it definitely depends on the person's body composition, how much they weigh, all of that. That upper range is actually more so people associate that with being the max amount of protein you can absorb from a meal, but that's actually, at least from what I know, that's not true. It's actually the upper. That's actually referred to as the maximum amount of muscle protein synthesis. So within what the muscle does to stimulate muscle growth, right, and muscle repair. But in terms of your overall body, like, we know that protein is not just for muscles, right? You do so much. There's so many other processes in your body that protein is used for. So that's like something that I think people got a little bit confused on in terms of that upper limit. Like, you could eat 100 plus grams of protein in one meal and technically absorb all of that protein. But for many people, that's going to be like just a digestive distress that's going to be too much to handle. Some people, if you're like, you're bigger, maybe you're training twice a day, you have tons of muscle mass, like you have, you're heavier, like they'll probably be able to deal with a little bit more protein. But in terms of, like, from what I know, in terms of absorption of protein, like, it's not that your body can't absorb it. It's just that in terms of using it for muscle protein synthesis itself, that has a little bit of a cap on it, but that will also be individualized to the person in terms of how much muscle they have. But then, like, as you know, if you eat like 100 grams of protein in a meal, you're probably not going to feel that great, because it's going to be a little bit harder on your digestive system, bloat, all that stuff. So that 50 to 60 like per meal, I recommend that, like, for most people as well. But again, it'll also depend on like how much you're eating throughout the day, and like how much muscle you have and how much body weight you have as well. So that's at least what I'm, yeah.
I think for most people, I'm like, I'm struggling to get 20 grams a meal. Maybe some people, and that's what, focus on at least that minimum to reach that threshold for muscle protein synthesis. And then for fats, it's really important to look at the quality, avoiding trans fats, avoiding the processed omega-6 fatty acid, like the canola, safflower, sunflower, soybean oils, which are in a ton of processed foods. All of those will lead to insulin resistance, even though they don't have a direct like blood sugar insulin response. And the mechanisms behind that is really interesting. But I say saturated fat is neutral. I have a good podcast interview with Dr. Nadir Ali, ALI, and he talks about, when your LDL goes up on a low carb diet, how do you determine if that's a problem or not for you? Because elevated total cholesterol and elevated LDL is one barrier that I see people thinking about when they're thinking about eating more animal products. And it's important to kind of come to terms with elevated LDL in and of itself isn't unhealthy. You have to look deeper than that. What are like the particle sizes of LDL? And Dr. Ben Bickman talks about that in depth really well in his book too. So that's another resource. So when it comes to fat, really prioritizing the healthy sources of fat that help keep insulin low, that help trigger satiety, and omega-3 fatty acids from fatty fish can be great because they also help reduce inflammation. So from a dietary standpoint, there's a lot bigger fish to fry. There's a lot more in-depth detail advice that I give besides like eat fewer calories. We're talking about the quality of the food and the timing of the food. And then for insulin resistance and perimenopause and menopause, we have to address stress. And we have to recognize that chronic sleep deprivation, burning both ends of the candle, is a form of chronic stress. It will raise your cortisol, because cortisol is good. It helps us fight or flee the stressor. But when it's chronically elevated, which happens if we're always stressed out or if we're always even exposed to different toxins in our environment that we're not aware of, like blue light is one that I'm getting more and more into. We'll talk about that. You're keeping your insulin and glucose up unknowingly, and you're going to make weight loss a lot harder because you're keeping your glucose up because you're stressed out. It doesn't have carbs, it doesn't have calories, but it can still keep insulin up. So I think that's tough. And that's a tough behavioral shift because a lot of women in that age range are taking care of aging parents. They're raising kids and they're working. And they have to find the time for themselves. They have to take care of themselves so they can better care for other people. And one of my favorite new hacks are blue light blockers. And this is a really important concept. So if you're thinking about like the natural environment, the sun gives out all sorts of light: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, indigo, whatever, however you want to say the rainbow. And at high noon, there's about equal parts red and blue light in the sun. Now, tech developers are smart and they recognize that blue light increases our cortisol directly. So blue light increases cortisol because it helps keep us awake and focused and engaged with our work. But if you're constantly looking at your device, your computer, your phone, your television set, you're telling your brain it's high noon, and you're increasing your cortisol, which works in opposition to your melatonin, which is your sleepy hormone. So people might be going to the doctor saying, "Doc, I can't sleep." And they'll say, "Here's some melatonin," where the conversation really needs to focus on, well, what are you doing before bed? Are you blocking some of that blue light that is raising your cortisol and literally isn't letting your melatonin come up? So a couple hacks: you can adjust your screen settings to be warmer. That's what I've done. I have these blue light blocking glasses if you're watching on YouTube. So I do the dual blocking there. And then at night, I've got these Spectra ones that block almost all the blue light. And they help. I kid you not. I sleep so much deeper in the night and I wake up so much less when I'm making my internal light environment mimic my external environment, at least when it comes to blue light. So that's one easy hack someone can take from today to reduce their cortisol, reduce the blood glucose, reduce the insulin, and make weight loss easier and help your sleep. So it is so much more nuanced, and I think that people are tired of general advice from their doctor. You need to lose weight. You need to eat less and exercise more. It's like, that's not helpful. What else is not helpful are short-term, diets that they just can't do long-term. And I think that's why people like us are just so fed up with the traditional advice that we're going out on our own, and we're going to be that resource for people to really make those sustainable lifelong changes. And my ultimate goal is to help people prevent or reverse the diabetes, heart disease, dementia, et cetera, that I see in geriatric PT. And it really all comes back to, how does this affect my insulin?
Yeah. I mean, finding the root cause is always going to be the biggest thing. I'm thinking about, this is like a completely different conversation, but I just got a new trainer for my dog because my dog is very high anxiety, very she just like is always on like one sound. She like goes crazy. And this new trainer is all about like bringing it back to like, okay, what's the root cause of that? Like, why is she so anxious? Why is she so like, high strung all the time? And like, we're finding that root cause, which is in turn, it's been like a few weeks and we're already fixing all these other things that are going on that she's struggled with, or like I've struggled with, like teaching her to, do these things, like not bark at people walking by, and like just a bunch of dog things that are annoying. But the conversation to the root cause, like that is what's changing everything. So I just using that as a random example, because it's always about like, okay, it's not about the Band-Aid that you're putting on, right? It's about, all right, how can I fix these things that a lot of people just don't want to pay attention to, because it's not the cool thing. It's not the, sexy thing. It's okay. Pay attention to your stress, pay attention to your sleep, pay attention to eating real food. Like all people are like, oh yeah, like I'll do that, when I have time. Let me just take this. Yeah. So sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, you're right. It's like, and I work with a lot of people and they're very smart and they're like, I know this. And I'm like, why aren't you doing it? And that's really where the rubber meets the road, is doing things consistently. And I was in a business meeting with 4 guys, and one of them had done different weight loss things. And he's like, it sounds like one barrier to selling this to physicians is that they think their patients want a quick fix. They think their patients want a pill to make it better or want to see fast weight loss. And I'm like, yeah, like that's a barrier. But he said, it sounds like your approach is a lot more long-term and sustainable and doesn't suck. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't suck. You do feel good. You have more energy. You're full. You're not obsessing over sugar all the time. You don't feel like you have to go work out all the time. And he goes, I can see that when it doesn't stink, like when the process is doable, that people are okay if it takes a while. And that is so critical to come to terms with, that you're always in maintenance. Like even if you're trying to lose weight, you're still maintaining what you've already lost. And that's a critical mindset piece, to be okay with it taking a while. It's so much more effective than doing the yo-yo diet thing again and again and losing the same 20 pounds 5 times. So what you're saying is spot on, that it's not the sexiest thing. Insulin resistance is not the sexiest topic. And I understand that's an uphill battle. It's an uphill sell, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, this was great. I feel like there's a lot of key takeaways that you mentioned, a lot of kind of diving into some of the subjects that tend to be confusing. So I'm happy that you did that for our listeners to hear. So do you want to wrap up? We can wrap up and just tell everybody where they can find you on, social media, your website, all of that.
Yeah. So my website is weightlossforhealth.com, and they can just Google Dr. Morgan Nolte and they'll find it. They can find me on YouTube at Dr. Morgan Nolte. I have a podcast / YouTube like you. And so mine's called Reshape Your Health with Dr. Morgan Nolte. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Morgan Nolte. You can see, just Google my name and you'll find me. And I'm happy to help. My program is self-paced, so people can join, they can learn at their own pace. There's weekly office hours. It's just, I'm really proud, of what I've built, and that I've been able to help people really reverse their diabetes, high blood pressure, reduce medications, like get off statins. It's super rewarding work, as you know. So thanks again for having me on.
Absolutely. And thank you for being here. Thanks for your time. I will make sure to link all of that in the show notes. And yeah, I'm glad we had no technical issues today. Awesome.
Got our power stayed on. Yep.
All right. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of MetFlex and Chill. I hope you enjoyed it. It would be awesome if you could give the show 5 stars and leave a review on iTunes. We're trying to get placed in the top 100 health podcasts, and the 5-star ratings and reviews are what can help make that happen. I'll add step-by-step directions for leaving a review in the show notes. I know it's a big ask, but it really helps. Thanks again. See you next time.